Hi, and welcome back to our Ask the Agronomist video series. I am Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds. This week we're back out in the plots talking about more yield results on the soybean side. So we got a lot to share, but I want to share on the cover crop plot here because this is pertinent. We just actually planted this to cover crops here this weekend, so I want to talk a little bit about this plot and how it did this year. So soybeans, to set it up a little bit, I did plant an earlier maturing soybean for this area as our 1750 83s, which is definitely on the early side for here, with hopes to get a little wider window of planting at the end of the season now. Unfortunately, with the later planting and stuff, we didn't have a whole lot of extra time in terms of maturity and when these were harvested, so it didn't give us a whole lot of extra days in terms of planting. But so this was an earlier maturing bean, which we'll talk about too. So the overall yield of this plot was 65.7. It's really not too bad considering how they looked all season, although the average of the rest of our plots was 76, almost 77 bushel an acre. So they did really well. But if you look just to the other side of me here on my left, we have our no-till plot, and that gives us a little bit more to the story here because that yield averaged over the plot 67.3. So 67 over there in no-till, and 65 here in our no-till cover crop plot, so very similar. That was our 2193, so more maturity, more within the maturity that would fit this region, and still yielded similar. It's kind of drugged down by the same factors that we're going to talk about here. So the first thing I need to talk about is what was going on in this plot. This was all 1758s, although we did have some cereal rye that was allowed to grow just past planting. We killed it shortly after we planted, within that next week, but that was allowed to grow. The average of that part, which is to my right here, was 60.5 bushel an acre. And then if we looked at the rest of it, which that had cover crop on it as well, but it winter killed, that average was 69.2. So almost 9 bushel better from that side of the plot to this side over here that had the rye on it. So the rye definitely had a factor in what was going on out there. And I think this happened in several other cases. I had cereal rye on our own farm at home, and saw these implications as well. What happens a lot of times when the soybean comes out of the ground, even if it's dead, the cover crop is terminated, a lot of times you'll see that response. The soybean wants to try and grow a little taller because it's shaded. The straw being not green, it can still shade and cause influence on that soybean. So you'll see the soybean, the cotyledons will be 4, 5, 6 inches up, trying to get above whatever straw there is, or trying to get a little taller before they throw those first true leaves out after the cotyledon. So a lot of times you see really lanky stem on that lower stem to those soybeans in those situations. And unfortunately, when it's cool like it was this year, they spend a lot of time doing that, whereas the other soybeans in the other plots just came out of the ground like normal. They put their cotyledons were an inch or two or so above the ground, and then started immediately throwing on those first true leaves and then the first trifoliate. So they were ahead. They were actually about a whole growth stage ahead, and these were planted the same time as my high yield plot that we talked about last week, which was just behind me. So you got to understand the difference there. It did set them back, and that's where we see this yield loss, unfortunately, this year. And I think in a lot of no-till situations we saw that on our plot over here. And throughout Latham country, we had some different things that were going on, whether it was disease. In our case, we had excess nitrogen, which really exacerbated the iron chlorosis. And we also had what appeared to be some herbicide carryover. So the other thing I want to mention with this cover crop plot and our no-till plot over here is, as you continue to do no-till, the more years you have in no-till situation, you're not tilling the soil, you're not mixing that upper profile of the soil. You'll notice this, especially if you take different soil samples, but if you take a 0 to 6